Today's show is brought to you by Audible. Audible is offering our listeners a free audiobook with a 30-day trial membership. Just go to audibletrial.com/thestateofperfectbalance and browse the unmatched selection of audio programs. Download a title for free and start listening. It's that easy. Go to audible.com/thestateofperfectbalance and get started today. The State of Perfect Balance looks at solved and unsolved murders from the smallest towns across Ohio. We appreciate every one of our subscribers and read your feedback faithfully. If you feel that what we do is worth a couple dollars each month, please consider becoming a supporter. You can find out more on Podbean.
This podcast deals with true events of a violent and disturbing nature, intended for a mature audience. Listener discretion is strongly advised.
And just says, I already know my daughter's dead. I was in shock, and I can remember looking at him and then hearing this horrible sound and thinking, what in the heck is that? And it was me screaming no from somewhere deep inside me that I didn't even know was there. And at that point in time, I can remember just falling against Jeff, sobbing, just sobbing and sobbing and sobbing.
Hey guys, I'm your host Amanda, and this is The State of Perfect Balance. In listening to the stories we share with you, I hope you get a feel for the terrible trauma and horror experienced by both victims and their families. For a surviving spouse, parent, or sibling, it's a dividing line in their lives. There's life before they lost their loved one at the hands of a murderer, and life after, and everything after that line is entirely different. But of course, while we may be able to empathize with their stories, and in a small way feel their pain, there is no way for us to fully understand that experience unless we've experienced it firsthand. Mercifully, few of us will ever know that kind of pain. Becki Reiser and her husband Jeff are survivors of one of the most horrific losses we've ever learned of. The kind of traumatic loss which can drag the remainder of your life into darkness and anger. But in their case, it didn't. And it's a story of pain, shock, unshakable faith, forgiveness, and growth. I sat down with Becki earlier this year, and she was gracious enough to share the story of her beautiful and talented daughter, Elizabeth. We spoke for nearly 4 hours one chilly spring day, and today, I am able to share her story in her own words over a 2-part episode of The State of Perfect Balance. Dover sits in east central Ohio in Tuscarawas County, about an hour and a half south of Cleveland. Dover marked its 200th anniversary in 2007 and was once a player in the steel industry, prospering with hotels, banks, and an opera house. It's the birthplace of playwright Elliot Nugent, and today boasts extensive parks, a fancy faux Victorian clock on the square, and lots of choices for pizza. It is a quiet town of some 12,000 people, and is often described by residents, as almost all such towns are, as a quiet, safe, and friendly community, and it likely is. But Dover has also seen a remarkable number of horrific and violent murders. In 1989, a gay tavern owner was beaten beyond recognition at his own bar. In 1998, a girl barely out of her toddler years was stabbed to death, her body dumped under some bushes. In 2010, a young woman was clubbed to death with a clothes iron by her boyfriend. And a rather alarming number of corpses have been discovered in wooded ditches or hanging in the windows of abandoned buildings. If it's a quiet town, it's a quiet town marked by the occasional gory tale. Liz Reiser was a 17-year-old student at Dover High School. She was studious, well-liked, was active in her church, was a loving and obedient daughter, and knew exactly what she wanted from life. And this is her story. The story of a life that is taken is also the story of a life lived and a person who was loved. I'm going to allow Liz's mother, Becki, to tell much of this story. She was very open in sharing her experience with us, and we are enormously grateful to her for allowing us to bring you her experiences in her own words. Some of what you are about to hear has never been shared publicly before, and some of it corrects some rather fanciful notions presented in previously aired television true crime episodes. She began by telling us about Liz's childhood, as any mother would. Becki and Jeff had been married for 7 months, and she began to wonder if their desire for a child would be fulfilled when she became pregnant at age 23.
She was very strong-willed. She was strong. She was a very strong baby. She started crawling early. She was crawling by 5 months old. She was in her walker, and she would just go everywhere in her walker. She started walking the day before she turned 9 months old. She was talking a blue streak, and she didn't let anything get by her. She was just very aware, very alert, but the child never, ever, ever, ever slept the night through her entire life.
Liz knew early on what she wanted to do with her life.
From very young, she would play school with her friends. She was a mommy, too. She carried around a baby doll, and then she carried around several baby dolls, and then she had a Cabbage Patch cycle, which was like a big wheel for girls, and there was a basket on the back, and she'd put all these baby dolls in the back, and she'd ride it all over the house, and she'd take her baby dolls. She always had baby dolls. She loved babies. So when when I was pregnant for Micah, and he was born right before she was 18 months old, the day before, and she and I had never been separated before. So when I went to the hospital, she went to stay with Jeff's mother, and she was not happy with me in the least. And when they came to the hospital to get me, she would not even look at me. And I'm, wanting to see her and wanting to show her the baby, and she would turn her little head. And then, we get in the car, and she's still in a car seat, and the little monkey, she could wiggle her way out of anything. And she got herself out of the car seat, and she flipped the thing back, and she's like, I will hold him. I will hold him now. She wanted to be an 8th grade history teacher because of the 8th grade trip to Gettysburg and to D.C., and she was going to go to Gettysburg College. Yeah, we, just a few days or a week or so after she died, we got all the college information for her.
Liz had her own share of challenges to overcome.
Liz had severe scoliosis, so she found that out when she was in middle school, and she had a very distinctive limp and was in a lot of pain. And about a year before she died, we had been going to a specialist up in Akron, talking about doing back surgery and putting a French rod in her back and so on. And she was not able to do a lot. And when all of this started happening, she started to gain a lot of weight because her activity level went way down. When she was little, all she did was run, and she was the fastest kid in her class for years. And so she liked to do things. She had fun, but her extracurricular things, sports-wise and so on, were limited.
Liz's parents provided careful, thoughtful boundaries for their daughter's life. School nights meant homework and rest. Yet Liz sought special permission to spend a Tuesday overnight, a school night, at the home of her friend Brandy Hicks, and she made a very convincing case for why she should be allowed this unusual treat. Becki, however, was uneasy.
Unfortunately, I took the easy way out because Jeff and I gave in to her, and we allowed it because she had a marvelous argument. School was, for her, pretty much over. It was finals week, she only had one final she had to take because she was on the honor roll. Was exempt out of the other ones. The one that she had to take was a really simple one. And so she had turned in several of her books, and she was, doing everything. All her chores were done. And I didn't want to be the mean mom and tell her no, even though I didn't feel good about it. Mostly because I was afraid she was going to get hurt.
Tuesday turned out to be a difficult and stressful day for Becki, resulting in a migraine, and she sought quiet. Liz left for the evening, and there was no goodbye as her mom rested in a bedroom at the back of the house.
So I stayed back in the family room, the back part of the house, and I could hear Liz talking to my mom and on the phone and so on. And Brandy came and she told my mom goodbye, and she left. And I'm just in the back of the house feeling sorry for myself and didn't even say goodbye. And that has come back to, I hate to say the word haunt, but it bothered me immensely for well over a year.
Liz and Brandy went to the Hollywood Video in the adjoining city of New Philadelphia to rent a couple of movies before heading back to Brandy's to watch them and hang out. It was evening, and the two emerged from the store to find a man asking for help. He needed a ride home, he said, and had just walked more than 20 miles from Massillon and was exhausted.
But he said he had walked from Massillon earlier in the day, and he was so tired, and he just didn't think he could make it the rest of the way. I mean, he had quite a story that he told the girls. And so, they're listening to this, and honestly, in my mind, I mean, from the things that Brandy has said and from the things that the police have said and the things that Matthew said in his, police report, the girls were not willing to give him a ride at first. And he kept talking, and he kept talking, and he kept trying to make himself look like he was an okay kind of guy. And he told them that he was a student at Kent, and he was a psychology major. And, he was married and kids, and that part is true. But he told them that his name was Mark. So, he would tell them all this stuff, and, truth intermingled with lies. And they still weren't going to give him a ride. Well, when he offered Brandy $20 for gas to take him that far, at that point in time, Brandy was unemployed. Mm. And so, gas money is a good thing, Mm-hmm. And it's like, oh, well. And, it was Brandy's car. Brandy was driving. But I know she would have deferred to Liz and said, what do you think? Is this okay? I mean, he's going to give us $20 for gas to take him 2 miles or whatever. And so, in their minds, I'm sure they had no idea, no clue that there was danger. Mm-hmm. And, if it had been just one of the girls by themselves, I have no doubt that there would not have been, they would not have given him a ride. But because there were two, there's, the safety in numbers kind of thing, I guess they decided to go ahead and do it.
The first thing he asked was that they stop at a bridge so he could retrieve something.
And what he had done is he'd gone to Farmore, which was in the mall there where the exercise place is right now. That used to be a drug store, but they had all kinds of stuff. And he had gone in there and purchased beer earlier, and that's what was in the bag.
He made them drive for quite a while, and then things turned ugly.
When they got to the South School area, Brandy said, well, just tell me where I can drop you off. He says, oh, it's a little bit further. Keep going, I'll tell you when to stop. And so they kept driving and driving and driving. And they got out to, are you familiar with Old Town Valley? Okay, well, once they got out to St. Peter's Church right there, and there's that little road that goes off to the right, and then the kind of fork in the road. Brandy said, okay, we've got to have gotten you close enough. I'm going to pull over here and we'll let you out. I know you can walk the rest of the way. And at that point in time, he picked up the bag that he'd had and he pulled a gun out. Now, there was also a gun in with the beer. And he said, you're going to go exactly where I tell you to go. And at that point in time, they didn't have a lot of options. You know, it was in their mind, it was like, well, either drive or die. And so they drove, and he knew exactly where to tell them to go, because he said, now watch yourself here. There's a big, pothole, so go to this side, or the right side of the road is washed out, so don't get close to the edge, or, he knew exactly where he was telling him to go. And he took him over Matthias Raceway Road and across to where there's a big barn that has an Ohio Bicentennial painting on it. It's right by the highway, but that's where Matthias Raceway Road comes out there on the other side. And so they pulled up there, and then he told them where to turn. And as they came to these stops, Brandy could see partial names on the road signs, and but neither girl was familiar with where they were.
It was later that night, back at the home of Becki and Jeff Reiser, where the family was asleep. Becki didn't sense anything amiss and slept soundly.
I had to get back into mommy mode and wife mode and fix dinner and do all the normal things, and we went to bed that night, didn't think a thing. There was nothing.
But the family was awakened at 3:45 a.m. by a police officer at the door. And Becki was awakened by her son, Jordan.
And so the next thing I know, at 3:45, Jordan came upstairs, and he says, Mom, there's a policeman at the door. And he said, Brandy was in the river and Liz is missing. And, he woke me up, but I didn't think I was awake. I thought I was dreaming. And then he says, Mom, real loud, like waking me up. And he repeated it. And by then I realized, I thought, this isn't a dream. The front door was open, and this policeman was standing just outside the door. He was standing on the porch. He was not in the house. And the headlights from his car, were kind of silhouetting him. Mm-hmm. And that was like the only lights that were on in the house. Yeah, I've often wondered why. Why didn't God wake me up? Why wasn't I praying? But I have found out since then, in several of the places where I've shared and meetings and so on where I've been, I've had people come up to me and say, God woke me up that night at such and such time, and I was just praying. She said, I had no idea, or they would say, I had no idea who I was praying for, what I was praying for, but I just knew God had me up to pray for something. And I've had at least, I would say 8 people tell me this, people that I don't know. Mm-hmm. And there was one woman who lived right out by this area, just, a quarter of a mile away from where this happened. And she lived there, and she was one of them. She said God had her up that night praying.
The police left and said they would see that the Reisers were informed. In the meantime, Becki and Jeff, still in the underclothes in which they'd been sleeping, began to pray.
And Jeff said, we need to pray. And so he and I stood there and we prayed, and you have all these questions in your mind, and you're worrying, and you're thinking, where is she and what's she doing, and all this. And so I went over to the front windows. We had a big bay window, huge bay window, and I could see like 3 directions out this bay window. And Jeff went over and sat down on the couch. And I knew what he was doing because it was normal for him. His Bible had been laying open on the coffee table right in front of the couch. So when I heard those pages, that thin paper, it's a unique sound, and you know what it is because I just knew. And so he was sitting there and he was reading, and I'm standing at the window. And, excuse me, I'm practicing this speech in my head, all the things that I'm going to say to Liz when she comes home. Because, she was granted special permission and she was this and this and this, so, and she had never been a troublemaker. She was strong-willed, but she had never, ever been in trouble. And she was an excellent student and a good friend and busy in all these youth groups and so on. And so, for her to blatantly do something like this was so out of character for her. But in my mind, I'm getting this speech already. And as I'm looking, I could see across the playground, the East School playground, and it had just a chain link fence, so I could see, and I could see clear through to 3rd Street. And I could see someone walking down 3rd Street very slowly with a very decided limp, had kind of shoulder length, and it looked like hair, and she was fluffy. And so I was sure it was Liz, and this person was walking so slow, and I'm watching out the window. And as they get closer, I can see them walking down our road. And so I go out on the porch, and as this woman comes to the corner, and we were the first house there on the road, I'm standing there, with typical mom stance and waiting, and I'm watching, and this woman just keeps walking. And I realize when she's right in front of, the house, that it's not Liz. Even though she's built like Liz, she walked like Liz, her hair was similar to Liz's, it was not Liz. And at that moment, my heart just, that sinking feeling. Mm-hmm. And I watched her walk on by. And the stupid things that you think of, it's like, why aren't you Liz? Why aren't you my daughter? And, and what normal person is out walking at, 4:15 or 4:30 in the morning? Who does that, And so I walked back in the house, and I think I said to Jeff it wasn't her. And I went back to the window, and he was still sitting there reading. And I stood there for a long time and just, thought and stared out the window. And all of a sudden, right before 5, I can remember, and it's in my book, very vividly hearing like the ticking of the clock that I was standing right by, and it was like so loud. And I can remember looking up at the clock, and it was 4:57. And at that point in time, I could feel the hair on the back of my neck raise, and I knew that God had spoken to my husband.
In such moments, in the wake of a shock and having so little information, time seems to pass extremely slowly, and Becki stood in the window for what seemed like an eternity, when in truth it had been just over an hour since they had been awakened to learn that their daughter may be missing, and Becki looked at the clock.
And at that point in time, I could feel the hair on the back of my neck raise, and I knew that God had spoken to my husband. I just knew it. I could sense it. And I turned around, and I looked at him. I said, what did God just say to you? And he looked at me, and these big eyes, and he put his head down, and he closed his eyes, and he sat there for, it seemed like an eternity, but I'm sure it was just a few seconds. And he looked back at me, and he says, well, God said a lot of things, but we can go to the hospital at 6 o'clock.
At Union Hospital in Dover, authorities had gathered at the emergency room. The Reisers had arrived without being informed of anything, and their appearance was quite a surprise.
And so I'm not thinking anything about it. I'm just following behind them and going in, and when they got to the door, they opened the door, and there were several people in this room, and, the policeman says, I'm sorry, we need to use this room. Could you please allow us to use this room? And I'm thinking, well, that's kind of rude. We can go somewhere else. Didn't think anything about it. And the other people that were in there left, and one person looked familiar, and I couldn't figure out why. Well, then I found out why. It was Randy's other roommate, Jen, who It was the youth group leader. It's like, well, duh. So anyway, we walked in there, and I can still see this room. I can see the furniture. There was an orange love seat, that squeaky, butt-sprung orange furniture. And Jeff and I sat down there, and directly across from us was this other man that Bobby Everett had been with. And Bobby was on the right, and he knelt down, kind of stooped down on the floor. And then over to the left were Dode and Katie sitting in chairs there. And what I didn't notice at the time was that there were two nurses that also came in that room. And one was over on one side of Jeff, and then one was by me. Well, we're sitting there, and the man across from us introduces himself. He says, "My name is Walt Wilson, and I am the lead detective for Tuscarawas County Sheriff's Department," and so on. And he started to talk, and Jeff interrupted him. And we'd been there maybe not even a minute. And Jeff says, "I already know my daughter's dead."
In the coming hours, days, and weeks, Becki and Jeff would learn the details of what had happened that night. In part 2 of this episode of The State of Perfect Balance, you'll learn too, as Becki Reiser tells us not only what happened to Liz, but how she and her husband found a way to cope with the terrible shockwaves to come. Thank you for listening to Season 2, Episode 1 of The State of Perfect Balance. You can follow us on Instagram at The State of Perfect Balance Pod and Twitter at State Perfect. We bring you new episodes every other Sunday night with solved and unsolved murders in the smallest towns across Ohio. And remember, lock your doors. Evil lives everywhere. Not all small towns are safe.